Compensation Talent Management meeting to order. The first order of business will be to call the roll, please. Ms. Hopper?
Rob Feckner.
Good afternoon.
Margaret Brown. Here. Lisa Middleton.
Present.
Stacy Oliveris.
Here.
Michelle Mitchell for Arena Ortega. Teresa Taylor.
Here.
Shonda Wesley.
Present.
So, Mr. Chair, the only one I don't see is Michelle Mitchell for Arena Ortega.
Okay, well, we will continue. If she gets on here, then we'll welcome her then. So item 2 is the approval of the June 16th Performance Compensation Talent Management Committee timed agenda. What's the pleasure of the committee?
Move approval.
I see moved by Taylor, seconded by Brown.
Sure.
Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor. Ms. Hopper, please call the roll.
Margaret Brown.
Aye.
Lisa Middleton.
Aye.
Stacy Oliveris.
Aye.
Michelle Mitchell for Arena Ortega. Teresa Taylor.
Aye.
Shonda Wesley.
Aye.
I have all ayes, Mr. Chair, waiting upon Michelle Mitchell to attend.
Very good, thank you. Agenda item 3, the executive report. Mr. Hoffner.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Doug Hoffner, CalPERS team member. Today we have 2 action items before you. Michelle Tucker will introduce those momentarily. Before we get to that, I wanted to cover one other item. Since we last met, we have completed and received, not completed, we've received the request for proposals from 7 firms related to the board selection of an executive incentive compensation consultant. And that solicitation concluded in May. The goal would be to bring that material back to this committee via the subcommittee process that was identified and have that selection done and presented to the full committee at the September 2020 board meeting. At this time, that concludes my presentation. Take any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Very good, thank you, sir. And I see Ms. Ortega has joined us.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Okay, then that brings us to agenda item 4, the action consent, approval of the April 22nd committee meeting minutes. What's the pleasure of the committee?
Move approval. Second.
Moved by Brown, seconded by Taylor. Ms. Hopper, please call the roll.
Margaret Brown.
Aye.
Lisa Middleton.
Aye.
Stacy Oliveris.
Aye.
Irena Ortega.
Aye.
Teresa Taylor.
Aye.
Shonda Wesley.
Aye.
All ayes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Brings us to agenda item 5, the information consent calendar. Seeing no request to move anything off of that, off of number 5, we will move on to action items number 6. 6A is the annual review of the 2020-2021 incentive metrics. Ms. Tucker.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. This is Michelle Tucker, CalPERS team member. Agenda item 6A is an action item which seeks approval of the incentive metrics for fiscal year 2021. The board's primary executive compensation consultant, Grant Thornton, has reviewed the metrics for fiscal year 2021 and is proposing no changes. Upon committee approval, some combination of these metrics will be included in fiscal year 2021 incentive plans for investment management, deputy, and senior leadership positions. I'll now turn it over to Mr. Gonzaga and Mr. Mishka of Grant Thornton, who will present the item and answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We welcome the team of Erics.
Thank you. So Eric Gonzaga here from Grant Thornton, and this will be quick, but we have reviewed the various incentive metrics and plan goals with respect to each metric. And consistent with history dating back to when the plan was implemented about 4 years ago, the plan continues to use a good solid array of performance metrics, organizational metrics, to align the entire leadership team on the same set of metrics, specifically fund performance. How well is the fund performing on a relative basis? Enterprise operational effectiveness intended to manage the efficiency of the organization. Investment office CEM measures the efficiency of the returns. Customer service, of course, making sure that benefits are delivered in an appropriate manner. And stakeholder engagement. How does the organization meet its mission relative to stakeholder perspectives? And as we reviewed those 5 metrics, recognizing that there was no change over 2019, 2020, we firmly believe that this is a good solid array of metrics to align the organization on the same set of performance metrics. It's a very good sample of and consistent with market practices in terms of how organizations are measured. In addition, the degree of challenge is consistent with last year, recognizing over the last 2 to 3 years there have been some tweaks to enhance the challenge of the various goals. So with all of that, we do not recommend any changes to the proposed metrics. We think the measurements are appropriate, the degree of challenge is appropriate and reasonable. And the primary perspective that we would offer is just simply that staying the course makes sense this year, particularly given the dynamic environment with the ebbs and flows of the economy and the pandemic environment. We think that the metrics continue to represent a best practice sample of the balanced scorecard. Of course, going into next year, we always recommend reviewing the various performance metrics for performance challenge, making sure they're not too hard, making sure they're not too easy. Other than that, our primary, other metric is just making sure that, on the long-term incentive plan side, we just offer this up as a consideration, just in terms of extending participation to include the CIO, in addition to the non-investment office executives. Consistent with the annual incentive plan, the point would be to align, the rest of the executive team on the same set of metrics from a long-term incentive plan standpoint, consistent with the mantra of one CalPERS. So with all of that, that ends our presentation.
I thank you. Both Erics, thank you both for being here. I have a question from Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question with regard to attachment 1, page 1 of 2. And that is on enterprise operational effectiveness, because it looks like that score is based on reducing overhead operating costs as a percentage of total operating costs. And so the part of my question is twofold. Because of COVID-19 and the way we really have reduced, I think we've reduced costs, just because we're not traveling, there's a lot of savings. I'm just wondering if that needs to be amended. And also, we are going to be potentially cutting back on costs in terms of, with the state's budget. And so I'm not sure if we need to revisit that enterprise operational effectiveness, because in fact, it's not the executives that are making this happen. There's outside forces causing these changes. I guess that's for the consultant.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, when you think about a comparison to last year, that's a very good point. I mean, this is a pretty dynamic environment. It's certainly something, worth investigating. Ultimately, the issue comes down to incentivizing management within, what they can control. And that's the whole purpose of an incentive plan. And to the extent that the cutback in expenses is outside of the control of management, certainly there is reason to at least take another look at it. No different than historically, third party costs were taken out of the equation, or board expenses were taken out of the equation in terms of performance measurements, simply because those were expenses that were outside of the control of management. So I would say, to the extent that they are, absolutely, that would that would warrant a look at it. So.
Yeah. And I know that there are offsetting costs with COVID-19 because we're having to do more work at home. And so IT and infrastructure security, that also increases. But I think we should just take a look at that from a management perspective. So we're not incentivizing something that really isn't something that management caused some operational effectiveness. I just want to ask that. So if we could take a look at that again, that would be helpful. And then I had another question with respect to um, the survey questions. I'm looking at customer service, which is page 2 of 2, and we talk about these customer services as measured by surveys. And I have a general question about surveys. Who comes up with these survey questions? Does the board get to see these in advance? And then does the board actually get to see the full range of answers, as opposed to normally we see these little icons and you give us this little shorthand version. I'd like to see the full survey. And then the second part of that question is, it says, and other methods. So what other methods are there? I mean, we're talking about metrics, and other methods does not feel like a metric to me.
Yeah, and so from a consultant perspective, I'm sorry, was there somebody else speaking?
No, just you.
Okay. Okay. Well, from a consultant perspective, what I'll say is that the surveys that are performed are run internally, by your various departments, whether it's on stakeholder engagement or customer service. I know they were revamped within the last few years, and there's certainly adequate sample size. This is something that is internally managed, and whether or not you have access to the full array of scores, I'm not sure about that. I guess that would be with likely there's some committee review of the full survey results, but certainly consistent with historic methodologies, and I can't imagine that there would be any pushback in terms of broader disclosure of the various surveys. So.
Great. And then what are and other methods?
I think from a performance metric standpoint, the survey questions were the primary focal point. So.
Okay, maybe we should just take that out if there aren't other methods. I don't know if anybody else can tell me.
Yeah, so Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer the question. So basically, the two questions are identified in page 2 to Mrs. Brown's point: the benefit payment timeliness, as well as the customer satisfaction scores. Those are also recorded and provided to you on a quarterly basis through the enterprise performance reporting, and we provide to the board through the full board of administration committee. And you can see those are training data going back years. Those were identified and approved by the board at that time. So when these measures were created, we effectively built them on things that we had enterprise data on. And so we'd be happy to provide any additional information to the committee's request. But essentially, those are metrics that we're already reporting as well through the enterprise performance reports. And I can confirm or look into the other methods, but really it's around the two customer satisfaction questions about the timeliness and the satisfaction of the customers of the services they're providing or we're providing to them.
Great. I'd appreciate it maybe if, since we're talking about metrics here, that if there aren't other methods or they aren't identified, that we remove that, only because other methods is not something you could measure unless, I don't know, just left the question.
And sure. And to further clarify, the metrics that are identified in these plans are also then validated by a third-party provider as part of the policy that the committee and board has approved. So it's, while we do the surveys internally, they're then going to run through a third-party provider to analyze and validate the information and data that is presented to the committee and the board in terms of compensation results.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. I have Ms. Taylor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the report, I appreciate it. I will say, Margaret, I understand not wanting to use outside forces for our measurements on some of these issues, like you were mentioning, the cost cutting. I will say, however, knowing what other state agencies have done in terms of moving into teleworking, et cetera, CalPERS was at the forefront, as well as making sure that their staff is performing at or above levels necessary to keep the teleworking viable. And that's just a product of me being in state service. So I'm well aware that, you know, we have a ton of agencies in the state of California. Many agencies, you know, this was a difficult move for them. So CalPERS was at the forefront, making sure that they had 75 to 80% of their folks out teleworking right away, and at the forefront of, and I think that goes a lot to teamwork and leadership. When your team is performing and outperforming your old metrics when they were in the office, that to me shows, when I think about several other agencies I can think of right now that aren't anywhere near that, that means that your leadership is doing well. So no, they didn't cause COVID and you know, make those cost savings happen. The 10% pay cut isn't something that I think we should be considering in the cost savings by any means. That's the state cost savings. But CalPERS leadership did perform admirably during this time.
Thank you. Ms. Oliveros.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm following up on Ms. Taylor and Ms. Brown's comments. The question. So in looking at enterprise operational effectiveness, a couple thoughts. First is that I think CalPERS did a remarkable job in going offsite in working remote. Within the investment industry, that's not done. And this is the first time in history since Wall Street was opened that that's probably happened. So it's a remarkable feat, and CalPERS did it almost seamlessly, if not seamlessly. But the other part I wanted to ask about was if this is a year-over-year metric. So if we anticipate that expenses are going to be much lower in 2020 due to remote work and due to budget cuts, how will that affect 21-22 measurements?
Oh, you know, that's a good point. And that's part of, you know, the process, just like you have in recent years, is you reviewed the metrics for appropriate challenge. I mean, this is something that we're dealing with for-profit companies, you know, private companies, is how to measure performance, you know, on a year-over-year basis. And I think, you know, particularly when it comes to next year, you know, the comparison of year over year, there's going to be a lot of conversations and a lot of due diligence done in terms of comparison to, you know, the prior year, because there is the potential for, you know, the performance metrics, at least from, you know, the performance in 2020, to potentially be quite understated, you know, recognizing that, you know, these are all, you know, the pandemic, the economic uncertainty. What we don't want to do is, you know, result in windfalls to executive teams because they're measuring performance over a down year. And so, you know, how we get there, we don't know, but, you know, it will be based on budgeting going into, you know, 21, 22, in addition to certainly taking into account 2019, 2020 performance. And, you know, how much, you know, 2019, 2020 gets weighed in there is really going to be dependent on what happens over the next several months. So it will be, you know, you're going to have to take a look at everything in terms of forecasting, in terms of what's the long-term, you know, expectation, if anybody knows at that point, both economically in addition to the pandemic, to see how much 2019, 2020 matters. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Ms. Ortega.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question maybe for Michelle or Doug, I'm not sure. I'm wondering Just for my clarification on, as you know, the governor has proposed 2 furlough days per month for state employees beginning in July. And I just want to confirm my understanding of how that would work in terms of incentive plans. And to the extent the incentive is calculated on salary, is it calculated on the salary before the base salary before, or is the furlough or PLP or however it might be implemented calculated into the incentive calculation? Just wondering if the incentives are reduced by by the effect of the salaries being reduced.
Hi, this is Doug. So thank you for the question. I think we need to get clarification on that as to what we did back in 2008, 9, 10. My understanding from on a retirement side that they are not, but we need to confirm that, and we're happy to bring that information back, and Michelle might have further clarification on that.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Ms. Ortega. Yes, we can go back and confirm and see what was done in 2008, 2009. My understanding of the calculation is that it's based on the compensation for the prior year, but I'll go back and confirm that, Ms. Ortega.
Anything else, Ms. Ortega?
Thank you. That's it.
Very good. Thank you. I have Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Fechner. So on the opposite end, I'm going back to my same point of how COVID and social distancing could impact the results. It also could impact stakeholder engagement negatively, since we're not having all these face-to-face meetings, we're not having a lot of these opportunities. I think it also could impact stakeholder engagement as well. So while I don't want to be giving away the money, if it's not earned, I certainly don't want to be penalizing for something we can't help. So I'm hoping we'll look at those as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and Ms. Brown, that is something that, you know, we kind of hint on that in the memo. I mean, we were a little bit worried about that when we were taking a look at the metrics. What does it do relative to stakeholder engagement? And I think that what we're telling a lot of our clients right now is that you don't want to make a drastic change too soon, because it's just too soon to know what the impact is going to be. You know, ultimately, you know, we want our incentive plans to be as metric oriented as possible. But you know, there's 2 ways to get it right, and part of it is discretion at the end of the year. You know, the other part is, you know, let's wait till we have a full performance period in this current environment before you know, we move to the next step in terms of you know, any drastic changes to the metrics. So it's a very good point, though.
So on that point though, I mean, we don't want to be changing metrics, you know, after the fiscal year has started, right? So once we set these, are these set in stone, or can we modify them, or should we even be modifying them once we,
Right.
you know?
Right. Yeah, and there is a degree of, you know, there is always a degree of flexibility. As a board of directors, as a committee, you don't want to be changing the metrics too often. But there are situations, and it's this, you know, whether it's the financial crisis or it's the pandemic, you know, these situations that are so outside the control of management. Again, with the concept being we want to reward for fair performance. We don't want to overpay. We don't want to underpay. No different than if there was a windfall. There's nothing wrong with reducing awards in certain instances. You know, I think that, you know, 1 year out of 10, the board or the committee may want to exercise discretion, or you know, may potentially. I mean, there are some of our clients are talking about changing the metrics midstream. Our thought is that before we change the metrics, we would rather you spend more time exercising discretion at the end of the year, as opposed to changing the metrics midstream, again, because this is such a dynamic environment. We just don't. Nobody knows for sure what's going to happen. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Seeing no other requests for questions, I know we have some, it's an action item. So first, let's find out what's the pleasure of the committee.
I'll move approval.
Or second? It's been moved by Brown, seconded by Taylor. Before we take the motion up, I know we have some folks in the public that wish to speak. Mr. Fox, do we have anybody who wants to speak on item 6A?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have one commenter on 6A, Mr. J.J. Jelensik.
Can you hear me?
Good afternoon, Mr. Jelensik. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I just want to note that there is no incentive about health care in here. And, you know, the incentive program in many ways is a message to staff. It indicates, you know, the things that the board feels are important and that they're willing to pay for. And so I would suggest that you add something about a health criteria. Possible areas is holding down monthly premiums or holding down costs, including out-of-pocket, accessibility, healthcare results for the members. Healthcare is obviously an important part of CalPERS and ought to be reflected in the incentive compensation. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Anyone else, Mr. Fox?
No, Mr. Chairman, that is it for item 6A.
Thank you. Anything else, Mr. Hoffner, before we go to an action item?
No, nothing else from me at this moment. Thank you.
I would assume part of what Mr. Jelensik just spoke about is what Mr. Gonzaga talked about the non-executives.
I think what he's looking, I think my understanding of what the comment from the public was is sort of a higher overarching health performance metric that would cover really as sort of the entire organization. There are metrics within individual plans or individual folks that cover health-related items, particularly for those folks in the health programs that are incentive eligible. But I think what I understood it to be is more of like maybe a proposed metric number 6, which hits healthcare related items that again cut across the enterprise.
Very good. Thank you for that clarification. So a motion being before you, Ms. Hopper, please call the roll.
Margaret Brown,
Aye.
Lisa Middleton,
Aye.
Stacy Oliveris,
Aye.
Irena Ortega,
Aye.
Teresa Taylor,
Aye.
Shonda Wesley.
Aye.
All ayes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Takes us to agenda item 6B, the 2021 incentive plan of the Chief Executive Officer. Ms. Tucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. This is again Michelle Tucker, CalPERS team member. Agenda item 6B is an action item which seeks approval of an incentive plan for the Chief Executive Officer for fiscal year 2021. The board's compensation policy for executive and investment management positions requires this approval annually. The proposed plan maintains the priorities and metrics from the CEO's fiscal year 1920 incentive plan. Any changes made to the incentive metrics as a result of item 6A will be incorporated into the incentive plan for the CEO. The committee may approve the plan as as presented, or direct changes. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Very good. Thank you very much. Any questions for Ms. Tucker or Mr. Hoffman? Seeing none, this is an action item. What's the pleasure of the committee?
Move approval?
I move.
Moved by Taylor. Who was the second? Was that
Stacy.
Ms. Oliveris is seconding. I see no questions from the committee. We do have, I believe, someone from the public that wishes to speak. Mr. Fox?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have one commenter, Mr. J.J. Jelensik.
Hello, I assume you can hear me.
We can hear you just fine.
Okay, the CEO is getting a very large salary increase starting next month. That's a decision that's already been made. In addition to that, she'll be eligible for a $135,000 bonus for doing her job. That again is a decision that's been made. My comments go to this item, but also go to the the incentive compensation in general. I've made the point before, I'll make it again, and the board has ignored it before and may very well ignore it again. But a paycheck is what you get for doing your job. A bonus is for going above and beyond. Simply meeting standards means you don't get punished. You hang on to your job, you keep your paycheck. It is even worse when you start getting an incentive bonus for doing close to your job, 75, 80%. A bonus should only be paid for extraordinary performance. Please rethink this whole gift of trust funds. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Anyone else,
Oh,
Mr. Fox?
Wait a minute, one other point. The clarification that Doug made on my previous comment was accurate. It was
Very
really
good.
an overall. Thank you.
Thank you for the clarification. Anyone else, Mr. Fox?
No, Mr. Chairman, that concludes the public comments on items 6A and 6B.
Very good, thank you. A motion being in front of you and a motion being clear. Ms. Hopper, please call the roll.
Margaret Brown,
No.
Lisa Middleton,
Aye.
Stacy Oliveris,
Aye.
Irene Ortega,
Aye.
Teresa Taylor,
Aye.
Shonda Wesley.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, I have 5 ayes and 1 no made by Margaret Brown.
Thank you very much. Brings us to agenda item 7. Thank you, Ms. Tucker, and thank you, Grant and Thornton, for your presentation. Brings us to agenda item 7, information, summary of committee direction. Mr. Hoffner, anything?
I think there were sort of 3 comments made, and more just for follow-up. Mr. Reyna asked a question related to pay rates, related to potential furlough days and what the compensation would be paid for incentives. So we need to clarify that and bring it back to the committee or via an email. There was a question related to the enterprise operating overhead effectiveness, sort of a relook. So I think that's more of a Grant Thornton takeaway. And then the question related other methods within the customer service satisfaction performance metrics. So happy to provide the answer to that question via email. I believe would probably be through the chair. That's,
very good.
To your satisfaction.
Very good. Thank you very much.
I think that was it on my end.
All right. I think you captured everything. Thank you. Brings us to 7B, public comment. Mr. Fox, anyone who wishes to speak on 7B?
Mr. Chairman, there are no signees for public comment on 7B.
Very good. Thank you. So this brings us to the end of our agenda. We want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank all the staff for their hard work and our consultants as well. This meeting will be adjourned. We'll see you tomorrow, folks.